Hello, everyone. It's Jennie and Laurie again. And today we are here to talk about the station of Saturn. So what does that mean? That means that Saturn has been retrograde for a period of time and it's turning direct. Before we get into that, let's just say that Jennie and I come together and we do all these videos and we have a lot of fun doing them. And we're so grateful to have you watching them. If we could ask for one thing, please like us, subscribe to our channel, make comments, tell us what you think about what we're doing, and just generally, interact with us as much as you can. Below the show notes, you'll find all the information about everywhere that you can find us and every other way that you can interact with us as well. And I think that's all we really need to say about us at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennie and let her talk about the direct station of Saturn.
Well, before we're going to just talk about what is Saturn. We're going to start by just kind of going over the meaning of Saturn, because sometimes people hear Saturn and they're like, "Oh my God," it invokes fear more than anything else. So I think we need to talk about a little bit about what Saturn is, and essentially, Saturn is structure, it's responsibility, it's maturity, it's authority. It's a place where you have to mature. And really there's a lot of growth that happens with Saturn, a lot of inner growth. But the whole idea is you take that inner growth and you make it into a concrete manifestation. So you might be ruminating about, I want to do this or I want to do that. But the moment that you take the plunge and actualize something in a concrete, tangible, measurable way, you are in Saturn realm. So that is, there's so many different things that Saturn means, but Laurie, tell us some of your meanings of Saturn.
Well, Saturn's such a fascinating planet, and I think it's one of the reasons it has the reputation it has, I think, is because early on in people's learning a little bit about astrology, they often hear all about the Saturn return. And we'll talk about the Saturn return itself a little bit later. But I think that's where some of the, oh my God, Saturn comes from, is this, like, everybody gets scared about the Saturn return. And Saturn really, like you said, Saturn has so many gifts. Without Saturn, we would just, God knows what would happen. But we really need Saturn in order to build a life of any value. On the, you definitely, Saturn is considered the god of time, of old age, and of death. It's father time. So, but part of that is it takes time to build structures in our lives. We don't come out of the gate at age 14 with a fully structured life to live. We have to grapple through our lives before we get to a point where we have the serious structures that really support us. And really, that's what Saturn is about. It's about building the structures that support a life. We'd be pretty bad off without Saturn.
Yeah. I like, as you thinking about, as you mentioned, Father Time, I think a lot about, if you were to, when you cut open a tree and you see the rings, you can count each ring and you see exactly how old the tree is, and you can see how old it is in terms of like all the seasons, like what was the summer like, what was the winter like. That's why the rings look so different on a tree. So that's one way to think about it, is it is kind of like counting the rings. And of course, Saturn, the planet, does have rings. The actual planet, if you look at it through a telescope, you can see those rings. And that kind of starts to bring in the whole designation of the idea of Saturn is where you set limits. Saturn is where you have boundaries. Saturn is where there is this containment, this necessary containment. And like you said, where would we be without Saturn? I mean, it's sort of like a puddle on the floor. I mean, you're not getting anywhere without it, because it really, really signifies our growth and maturation, which comes about in cycles. It's not just a linear thing. I mean, of course, there's a linear piece to you're born, you go through life, and you die. Okay, yeah, that's linear. But within that linearness, there's a ton of cycles. And we'll talk more about the cycles of Saturn a bit later in this video. But just the idea of there being a growth process that you must walk throughout your life.
Yeah. And, Saturn Saturn requires that we spend time alone. There's a loneliness quality to Saturn, which is another reason people tend to not like it, because it's sort of in these spaces of alone time that we really mature, So there's so much about Saturn, about authority and responsibility and all of those things, which seem like negative words, but they're really very necessary in
It's
order
how
to
you get
create
something
wealth.
done.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I think Stephen Forrest, let's see, he talks about it being, Stephen Forrest is a great astrologer. If you don't know of him, check out his stuff. He's really interesting. But he talks about it being where you must see reality clearly and then take effective action, and respond to whatever the reality is of your life. And so that it really is that. And we live in a society that responsibility and accountability are pretended to be optional. But they are not. I mean, this is how you live your life, is by taking responsibility for yourself. And Saturn really insists on that. And so I think that's part of the reason our particular Western culture is sort of frightened of it, because there's a people being frightened of taking responsibility for themselves. And Saturn does bring up fear, and there's a sort of a bleak nature to Saturn on the more negative, but it's because it's where you collide with reality. And sometimes that's just not pleasant. It's just, life has its challenges. So
Yeah, and facing the reality of those challenges is the work of Saturn. And we all have to work with Saturn, or we're going to, just end up in a gutter somewhere. So there's that. Okay, so I think that kind of covers the meaning of Saturn, unless if we could also bring in how Saturn can be paired with Jupiter. Let's talk a little bit about that. You can think of, the sun and the moon are the luminaries. They're not even planets, they're the luminaries. And then we've got Mercury, Venus, and Mars, which I think of as the inner planets. And then we've got Jupiter and Saturn, which are paired together as the social planets. And they are very much kind of opposites of each other. Jupiter expands things, and then Saturn narrows down and constrains and restricts. And yeah, so you can, if you think of those two together, you can think about what would happen without Saturn, and Saturn is the last of the visible planets, which is one of the reasons it's designated as restriction. It's the last thing that we can see with the naked eye out there. We can't see Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto unless we've got a telescope. So Saturn is the limit. And Saturn coming after Jupiter, it limits all that enthusiasm and excitement and expansion that Jupiter would just, go off somewhere. So we need that restriction, that containment of Saturn.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's true. Like, if you read a lot about Hellenistic or more ancient astrology, it kind of ends in a lot of ways with Saturn, because it is that visible planet. And so it's considered, the timekeeper, the holder of the keys. And in ancient astrology, it's really talked a lot about as the sort of greater malefic that causes all of these different challenges and problems. And there's a lot of really interesting things to use it in that way, to think about. I know, Laurie, you and I tend to more towards the humanistic astrology, where growth is so important, and how you change and respond to reality is so important. And that's what Saturn is really signifying. The second thing you made me think of, Laurie, and bringing that up with Jupiter, which I really love, is if you do any sort of spiritual practice, whether it's meditation, yoga, there's any number of practices that you might do, there's always this discussion of the balance between self-effort, which is Saturn, and grace, which is Jupiter. And so there's the whole quote about transformation flies on the wings of self-effort and grace. And so
I love that.
Yeah, it's really helped me in some of the practices that I do. But they really do go together. And in some ways it's like Jupiter's the inhale, where you're like, okay, and then Saturn's the exhale, where you empty back out. So these concepts are really simple. And they're really fascinating to think about all the different layers. So I'm really glad you brought those two things into the conversation. So
okay.
Yeah. All right.
So now let's talk about this retrograde. I mean, direct.
Okay, let's talk just briefly about some of the timing and astronomy involved here. I've got some notes down here. So basically Saturn is going to station direct November 4th. It's at 0 Pisces. So it's trying to go back to Aquarius, but it ain't gonna happen. So it's stationing right at 0. It's stationed retrograde this year on June 17th at 7 degrees of Pisces. So it's gone back 7 whole degrees since that retrograde station on June 17th. And this is roughly what you can expect from Saturn each year. Roughly, it retrogrades for about 5 months out of every year. And what it's doing when it's retrograding is it's really just about its relationship to the sun. And essentially, when Saturn comes into a trine aspect with the sun, that means it's going to be in the same element or very close to being in the same element, like almost there. It is going to station either way. So back there in June 17th, the sun was at the end of Gemini. And so it was almost in Cancer. And then Saturn stationed retrograde. And now the sun is in Scorpio, the other water sign. And Saturn in Pisces is now stationing direct. So there's a very tight relationship with those trines every year. When Saturn's doing either a station direct or a station retrograde, it's pretty close to being in trine with the sun. So it really describes that relationship. That's just a little bit about the astronomy behind these cycles. So
the only thing I want to say is, for those of you who are new here and some of this language might seem a little odd, the word station is when a planet stops and it's either preparing to go direct or retrograde. Obviously, no planets go retrograde ever. They always go around the ecliptic. The elliptic. I'm not saying that word right.
That was great.
Anyway, from our perspective, it looks like planets turn retrograde, turn backwards, and then turn forwards. But in reality, they're just always going forward. But what we are paying attention to is, from our perspective, what it looks like. And a station can be a retrograde station or a direct station. So that period of time, when did you say it went retrograde? In June?
June 17th.
Yeah. So you want to think about, what was it that you were moving forward on? And then June 17th or thereabouts, something occurred, and that thing, whatever it was, got put on a shelf, or, you forgot about it, whatever. But you can, if you can identify something along those lines, you can expect that it will probably start moving forward again. And not instantly. When these planets station, we say it stations direct. It's going to be a little while before it's fully in motion from our perspective.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the perspective, because that's really what this is all about, is perspective. And you're absolutely right. Saturn is always going in the same direction around the sun in real time, but from our point of view on Earth, it looks like it slows down and then it's going the other way. And it's a little bit like the whole train phenomenon of speeding past a train, and it looks like that one's going backwards. And I actually love this whole piece because to me, this is the whole point of astrology, is perspective. It's about giving you perspective. So I really, really like that you made sure that was clear in the conversation. And it is really, when you said, think about what things started to happen and then you backed off on it. And yes, I know exactly what that was for me. So I hope all of you are having a similar experience. What was it that you were starting to move on and maybe switch back? And of course, it does always depend on your natal chart. Do you have a sensitive point there? I do. Not everybody does. So if you're like, that doesn't ring true, hold your horses, check your chart. Because this is natal astrology that we're talking about, and it's really when it hits those sensitive points that things start to happen. So
absolutely. Okay. So I think that covers that. And now we want to talk about natal Saturn and how it plays out in your chart. And we're just going to, we could make a 6-hour video, and we're going to try to avoid that, even though we're tempted. But we want to think about, where Saturn is in an individual natal chart. It's going to be in one of 12 houses, and it's going, we use whole sign house system. So by that, each house holds one full sign. So if we know that Saturn is currently in Pisces, it's been in Pisces since March, I believe. And so you want to look, where is Pisces in your natal chart? And that's where Saturn is now, but that's not what I'm talking about. Excuse me. I'm jumping ahead.
That was helpful though. Yeah.
I'm jumping ahead. What we want to look at is you want to look at your chart and see where Saturn is in your natal chart. Okay. It can be in any sign. So wherever that is, understanding what the meaning of that house is will really tell you a lot about where you are required to work hard on your own and face reality and do some serious work.
Yep. And it's a place where you're going to have to ask yourself, where do I need to grow? Yeah. I mean, that's going to be, and then how does that growth going to get incorporated into my actual life, into what I actually do with my life? And those are the key questions for sure. Also, if you have Saturn retrograde in your chart, there's a set of meanings with that too. And it definitely suggests somebody who needs to really look within, dig down deep to find their own personal, deep sense of inner authority. And it might be hard to get at because it usually suggests someone that didn't maybe get the best role model, in that term, like didn't really get the authoritative love. So that's something to think about too, as you're looking at your chart, and just see if you have that little RX and see if it is indeed retrograde in your chart.
Yeah, if you've got a Saturn retrograde in your natal chart, some authority figures have been challenging to you. You have not had, like you said, you haven't had the proper role models for developing your own internal authority. And so you might have to work harder on that.
Yeah, it doesn't bring that whole retrograde thing. It kind of brings in that the need to do it on your own to even deeper degree. It's a little bit of a wild child, any planet you have retrograde in your chart. We've mentioned that before in some of our other videos, but just so you know that as you're looking at your own natal Saturn. So
one other thing I want to bring up is the fact that whatever house your natal chart, your natal Saturn is in, the work that you do there, the results, the benefits of the work you do. Let's say you've got Saturn in a particular house and you've spent lots of your effort and energy. You've worked on that. You can look at your chart and find the houses that hold the two signs that Saturn rules. That would be Capricorn and Aquarius. And those are the areas of your life that you will get the most benefit from the work you do in the house where Saturn is. So look at your chart and see how that connects. How does your natal Saturn in whatever house it's in, and the effort and work you've put in there, how has that benefited you in the houses that hold Capricorn and Aquarius? That's a fascinating exploration.
Yeah. I mean, for example, I'll talk just really briefly about my own chart. For example, I have Saturn in my 12th house. So I've had to do a lot of work and a lot of deep digging on my own subconscious patterns and learn, when do I need to take retreat, things like that. And it rules my 7th and 8th house. So all of the fruits of my labors goes into making my relationships better. When I do that retreat work, when I do that deep work, I can show up better in my relationships. Definitely not perfect, but I can see how that work comes out. And I have Capricorn in the 7th and Aquarius in the 8th. So it's both partnerships and then the boundary issues, the deeper issues that come about in those partnerships. So just to give you a really simple example, and just think for yourself where that plays out.
Yeah, it's fascinating to really do that, to really understand it. And of course, because Saturn is the planet of time, the older we get, the more this really makes sense, because the more work you've spent, the more time you've spent working in that area where Saturn is. So the more benefits will come into the houses that have Capricorn and Aquarius.
Nice.
So yeah. Okay. Now, what do we want to talk about? Let's briefly talk about the larger cycle
Yeah.
of Saturn. So Saturn, you can look at your chart, you can see where it was at the moment you were born. And then what you need to think about is it takes approximately 29 years for Saturn to go from that point where it is all the way around the ecliptic back to its natal position. So you can think of that. That's the full cycle. I love Saturn because it's such an interesting the way I think of it. This is kind of funny. I think of it as Saturn goes around, it builds a fence all the way around your chart. And when it comes back to its natal position, you are fenced in. You are a full adult. Our culture says we're adults at 21. Well, in some ways we may be, but we are not fully cooked. That's how I think of it. We're not fully cooked until we reach that first Saturn return. And that can be a challenging time for us because we are really pushed into a position of taking on adulthood at that point. That first Saturn return is when we just have to face the music of the fact that we are now an adult. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. Each quarter around that, each 7 years, basically, a little bit more, but you can think of 7 years as the first quarter square, 14 years, 21 years. So those are all really important ages. And you think, in so many ways in our culture, you hear constantly marriages hit the 7-year itch, whatever the heck that's supposed to be. But anyway, and, children at age 7, it's the age of reason. There's all kinds of other ways that 7 years it's a portion of that cycle, and it's a point of that cycle where real growth and maturity happens.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything more to say about that part before I keep plowing forward?
About the 7-year bit?
Yeah. Anything?
Yeah, no, I like you brought that up. And I was thinking that you were probably about to start talking about the second Saturn return as my guess, but
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
no,
So at about 29, you hit the first
Mhm.
Saturn return.
Yeah.
And then 29 years later, which will bring you to about age 58, you hit the second Saturn return. And I just think that's the best time of our lives. There is something about that. We're about 58 when that second Saturn return hits. And I think of this as breaking our lives into 3 sections. The first 29 years from birth until the first Saturn return, I think of that as, you can think of it as the youth. You can think of that as youth. And then the second 29 years, adulthood. And then the following 29 years as a state of wisdom, the elder. So, you in a lot of mythologies, you hear about the daughter, the mother, and the crone. So those really match up well. And then, because people live so much longer now than they used to back in the day, there is, at about age 87, if we live that long, we get our third Saturn return. And that one must put us into hyper wisdom mode. I don't know. I'm not there yet. But I look forward to it. The second Saturn return, to me, and with all the people that I've worked with through this period of time, it's a sense of freedom. It's like you've been through that cycle twice. When Saturn moves around the ecliptic, it touches off every point and every planet in your chart. It changes you. You grow, you mature, and then you get to do it a second time. And at that second Saturn return, there's so much. What I see in people is a letting go of, there's just a freedom, like not really just coming to that point of not caring what other people's judgments are. It's like, I've got my own judgments. I've got my own authority. I've like, no shit, I am my authority. And if I want to wear, purple spiked hair and go out on the street, I'm gonna, whatever it is, it really, I see it as a time of great freedom. I love it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and that last one you talk about, the age is sort of 88, somewhere in there. The passing of the torch. That's what I would like, the elder, the
Oh,
final stage of the eldership, and the passing of the torch kind of
wow.
thing. Anyway,
I'm so
cool.
glad you said that. I am so glad you said that. A couple of years ago, you probably remember me talking a lot, Jenny, about my aunt that I was with when she died.
Yeah.
She was just on the other side, or, I think she lived maybe a year and a half after her third Saturn return. And oh my God, she was such a gift to me in that last period of time. And I really had that sense of her passing a torch in some way. I love it that you just said that. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, are you ready to talk about, we're just going to do a brief run through without graphics, just a run through of what to expect as Saturn stations direct in your chart right now. So again, this is wherever you have Pisces in your chart, because Saturn is right now in Pisces. It's really imparting some kind of lesson around suffering, like what kind of growth is available, or how can you make your dream become reality? That's another way to think of Saturn and Pisces. We made a big video about that back when it went into Pisces back in March, but that video is still very much alive and awake. So check that out to get a deeper explanation of Saturn in Pisces in your chart, because right now we're just going to talk a little bit more about what to expect per house, and focus less on the actual Pisces piece, but just invite you to think about where Saturn is stationing direct in your chart right now.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Go back and listen to at least the piece that's for you in that Saturn entering Pisces. One of the things that we talked about was, creating a structure for the dream in that house. And that is just a beautiful way to think about Saturn going through Pisces, is we are structuring an area of our life that we have an idealistic dream, and we're building a structure within which to create that dream.
Yeah. And I think I know I might bring in the doom and gloom, a little more of the suffering of growth, but the reality is, what does suffering teach you? It teaches you about compassion. It teaches you how to have more empathy for other people's suffering, and takes you beyond the whole sort of intellectualizing it, but really getting it on a feeling, heart, gut level. That's really, so it's hard. It's not very pleasant. But that is ultimately the gift that it brings you, is that ability for empathy. And we could sure use a lot more of that right now. So
my goodness, yes, couldn't wait.
So those are kind of our twin, dreams and empathy. So think about that for yourself, and
and
which one you like.
The Pisces is where the suffering and the compassion and the empathy and the dream come in. Saturn is not about those things. Saturn is just the hard work that we have to do within that realm at this time while Saturn's in Pisces, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully that's clear. Send us comments if it's not.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, let's get started.
Meanwhile, if you've got Aries rising, where is this going to fall? If you've got Aries rising, it's in your 12th house, right? So that would suggest that you're doing some very deep inner work. You have, when Saturn is in a house, we have to face the reality of what's real there. So, if you've got Aries rising, you got to look at your own internal processes, your own internal unconscious patterns of behavior, and face the work that you have to do to create something more solid and workable there.
Yeah, well said. I mean, all I would add to that is there's definitely an isolation piece. There's that, with the 12th house and Saturn, there is some need to allow solitude to come in, some sort of retreat, some way that you can make space in order to really reflect on what does it mean for Saturn to station direct at this point in your life. So
yeah. And I always think when Saturn's in somebody's 12th house, it's very important to embrace solitude. It's also an excellent time to get therapy, because you're really motivated to do that deep inner work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Okay. So if you have Taurus rising, that means that Saturn is going to be stationing direct in your 11th house. The 11th house, Laurie and I always like to talk about as community, that place where you receive the support of your cohorts and people you have alliances with. And it's not, again, this isn't the friendship place necessarily. I mean, sometimes it can be groups of friends, but it's more the bigger community, like the impact of the work that you have to do. So there's something here that you've needed to face around your community, some way in which perhaps it's changing, or some sort of process in which your community is asking you to grow in a new way, or take on a new thing. There's some new responsibility perhaps in your community. So those are all things to think about.
Yeah, you want to really stop and pay attention. Are your needs being fulfilled in community? Are you receiving what you need? If you're not, it's time to go out and look for another community, create a community, do some work to shift the focus of the community, but that's where your work is.
Some kind of responsibility, I feel like, to community somehow. Yeah. Like it could play out in different ways, but that's good.
Yeah. So then if you have, where are we now? If you have Gemini rising, this is happening in your 10th house. So it's really about taking a look at your career path. Were you, prior to the retrograde, were you moving forward for, some new responsibilities in your career or your vocation, something along those lines that got set aside and now it's time to move forward? It's just really, this period of time is really focusing on facing the reality of what your career is, and doing the work necessary to make it what your ideal vision of it is.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, simply, you may be taking on more responsibility at work and coming to an understanding of what that means and what kind of growth, personal growth, you can use to take more responsibility for yourself in this area. So, yeah, okay. So if you have Cancer rising, this falls in your 9th house. The 9th house is worldview and perspective, your ability to think critically, higher education, travel, the search for teachers. All of these sorts of things can be 9th house. So with Saturn in the 9th house, there's some way in which you're needing to take responsibility for the next level of your learning, that you're needing to take some sort of action. There's some growth that's really required here. It's a real growth potential, and it is now time for you to really assess, like, okay, what do I need to do to step up to the plate here and take more responsibility for my overall worldview?
Yeah. Do I need to go back to school? Do I need to travel and see other worldview realities, so to speak? Or there's something that's a fascinating place. You might just be allowing your worldview to just be in a really passive manner. There may be a real passive sense, and this is really showing you that you have to take on some responsibility for what your world is. You can't just take on the worldview that your family told you was the proper worldview. This is a time to really face the reality of what you say, what you experience.
Yeah.
That's nice. Great. That's great. Okay, so if you have Leo rising, the Pisces, this station direct is happening in your 8th house. There's something in this area where you are really learning to grapple with other people's deep issues, and this can be a challenging one for sure. There's some way in which you have to face the fact that other people don't have the same values as you. This is a time of really important to pay attention to what your boundaries are in your most intimate relationships, and to really realize, I mean, it's perfect, really. Saturn is all about boundary setting and structure setting, and the 8th house is about learning how to set boundaries in order to navigate our most important relationships. So that's pretty clear.
Yeah. And probably not a very easy
No.
learning. In fact, yep, I do remember that time period of having Saturn in the 8th. And yeah, it's tricky, but very useful, and really allowing you to take authority in a new way, and to really come to terms with your inner authority and to stand tall with where you're at, especially if you have sensitive planets and so on in the 8th house. So, yep. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries.
Boundaries,
Not
boundaries.
walls.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. Okay. So then if you have Virgo rising, this is happening in your 7th house. Saturn is going to station direct in your 7th house. So it suggests some sort of process of maturation and growth that has to do with your partnerships. I mean, again, partnerships, the obvious one could be a marriage or a spousal type of partner, but there's also business partners. And then we always mention there's that whole anybody you're in a one-on-one connection with, those are 7th house relationships. You go on a walk with your best friend, that's a 7th house experience. So any of those are the material through which you're being asked to grow and change how you've been doing things, and really forcing you to step into a new level of responsibility in those partnerships. So a lot of thinking about who am I in partnership? Who do I want to be? And it's be really easy to look around and be like, who are the partners outside of me that I want to be with? But that's not really the question. The question is, how are you showing up for your partnerships? So that's what you really want to ask yourself.
Yes. And if your mind immediately goes to, oh, there's a problem and it's their problem, then this is a reflection. And this is I have Virgo rising, and you're definitely one of my people that I would say is a 7th house relationship. And, doing these videos with you, taking the responsibility of setting the schedule and sitting down and making these videos is definitely a learning curve for me. I'm such just doing everything by myself, and, kind of buckling down and taking the responsibility of doing something in partnership is it's a fascinating growth experience. And well, on the other side of my 2nd Saturn return, I feel like I have developed a pretty good relationship with Saturn, and I'm willing and able and excited to take on the work. So thanks for being one of the people in that place to help me do it, Jenny.
Thanks, Laurie. Appreciate that. Cool.
Okay.
Great.
So
Libra. Yeah.
So I'm on, right? Libra.
You're wrong. You won't.
So if you have Libra rising, this Saturn stationing direct is happening in your 6th house. You want to think about your health, your healthcare routines, your daily routines of all sorts, your dietary exercise, all of those things that support your health. And think about when Saturn moved, when Saturn went retrograde, was there some process that you were moving forward on here? And now you can get back on board. Were you developing a good meditation practice or a good dietary practice, and you've fallen off the horse, so to speak? Get back on. This will help you get back on. But there's you really want to think about what is your responsibility to your own healthcare, to your own day-to-day routines that support that. And the reality, how is it right now? How can you improve it?
Yeah. And the one other thing I think of sometimes with the 6th house, especially with Saturn there, is the development of competence and expertise. It could be a work related thing, or it might not have to be your work, but some way in which you've been honing a skill. And Saturn really is showing you what level you're at. Like, what do you need to devote more time? And it could be anything. It could be the way you play music. There's a lot of different things it could be, but just that idea of practice, because Saturn is about patience as well. And so there's some learning around being patient with yourself and allowing yourself to just keep buckling down and do the tedium of practice, because that's how you get better. So I think of that with the 6th house a bit. But
well, that's really that's great. I like thinking about that. Yeah.
Cool.
That practice for development.
Yeah, it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so if you have Scorpio rising, then you have Saturn charging through your house of fun. It means that there is some, it's about that's a really interesting one actually, because I think about it could be a process of like taking responsibility for making sure that you do things that are joyful. I mean, there's a funny little twist there because Saturn can be so heavy and kind of damp down, whatever's happening there. But really it's saying, hey, you need to take some responsibility to give of yourself more freely, to immerse yourself into this creative process you love, or to be more playful, with the children in your life, whether they're your own or someone else's, or any, I mean, it can be any kids, that baby that smiles at you in the grocery store. Those are those experiences of joy, because it happens. Anyway, so that's an interesting one, especially with Scorpio rising. It can be a little heavy. What do you think of that one?
Well, I think I always think of Saturn moving through the 5th house as a time where we can really learn that we can schedule fun. We can schedule, we tend to think that everything's supposed to be spontaneous, especially people are really it's interesting because the 5th house, we can think of it in different ways. Mostly I think of it as creativity, but also, like you said, it's children. It's also love affairs. And there's that whole idea of, lovers getting together. And then as the relationship develops and they're not, all over each other every 5 minutes. Well, and everyone seems to resist this idea of scheduling intimate time. And yet when Saturn's going through the 5th house, it's great to learn that scheduling intimacy, scheduling fun, scheduling time with those neighbor kids that you really would like to hang out with occasionally, scheduling these things is not a bad thing. It can really support, like we said earlier in the earlier part of the video, wherever Pisces is in your chart is a place where you have these ideals. And this is these structures, these scheduling can create a structure within which to create that magic. So don't resist. If you've got Scorpio rising, don't resist setting scheduled times for intimacy and play.
Oh, I love that you brought that up. Scheduling your date night, whatever that looks like.
Absolutely.
Fabulous.
Absolutely.
Great. Right. We're on Sagittarius, I think.
Okay, and I think that one's mine. Okay. I'm getting a little lost. Okay,
No,
so
you're
if
good.
you have Sagittarius rising, this Saturn stationing direct is happening in your 4th house. So this is really, there's some way that you're really working hard around home or family. And that can show up in terms of facing reality about the family dynamics that you grew up in or that you're currently living in. It could have something to do with facing the reality that the roof of your house is getting ready to cave in. It can show up in family of origin, family of that you're living in now, the home you're living in now. It can also have to do with your ancestry. There may be something in your ancestry that you've just discovered and you're grappling with, but there's something in that home and family area that really requires a lot of effort and work. And right now you're really getting ready to move back forward into it.
Yeah, I mean, the 4th house is an interesting one because it's so private. It's the most private area of the chart. Is way down on the bottom, but it also does refer to your like psychologically, like sort of the roots of your personality, like your own inner stability and emotional foundation. So that also might be a place, where if you're younger, especially, that might be a place how Saturn's showing up that is really deeply internal. And you said in the beginning, like having to kind of break away possibly or do something different from whatever your family roots are, whatever the process is about, you taking those roots and internalizing them for yourself so that you are a stable, rock solid person in that way. That really speaks to that. Yeah. The other one I really love is the idea of the 4th house being land, and it does relate to the ancestry, but I think there's been a big push recently too to recognize, original ownership, because that's not the right word, but of land. And so I really like that idea. So something along all those lines is where this growth process is taking place. So couldn't
Right.
help but bring that up.
Good. No, I'm glad you did, because I think
Yeah.
that's very relevant. That is
Mm.
very relevant.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so if you have Capricorn rising, then this growth process or Saturn stationing direct is happening in your third house. This is communication, how you speak. So you are learning a new level of taking responsibility for the words that come out of your mouth, you know,
Mm.
your voice, how you speak, how you decide what do you want to speak for. You
Mm.
know, these are so, and that's kind of at the simple level. Of course, there's always things like siblings in the third house, neighbors, and casual contacts. All of those three things all have to do with our immediate environment, one way or another. Usually, your sibling when you're younger, the neighbor, you end up living next to whoever because that's who lives there, right? You don't really have as much choice around any of those things. And then, same even with the casual contacts. So there's something about you learning a new level of responsibility through your communication and in how you navigate your immediate environment.
Yeah. It's a great time. I remember Saturn moving through my third house some years ago. I remember just, really taking on writing.
Mm, nice.
Writing really became important to me while
Mm,
Saturn was moving through there. And it's so interesting because with Saturn moving, approximately 2.5 to 3 years, you can go back through your life and look at the timeline of when Saturn moved through each house. And it's so fascinating to see that. But yeah, really paying attention to taking responsibility for your voice. That's bottom line.
yeah, nice.
You might, and you might find yourself in a position, if you have Capricorn rising right now, you might find yourself in a position where you need to take responsibility for a sibling.
Mm, mhm. Yeah.
That's also, this person we're talking about with it in the third house has Capricorn rising. So there's some maturity there that you can imagine that person being the one that goes and takes responsibility for an elderly sibling or something like that.
For sure.
Okay, so then if we have Aquarius rising, this is happening in your second house. And the second house is the area of your self-worth and how it connects with money and resources. So there's something about how you use or utilize money, resources, how that impacts your self-esteem. There's some responsibility, some way in which you need to really understand that connection
Mhm.
and possibly really taking responsibility for, yeah, how you spend your money. Do
Mm,
you, is that an area? I can imagine with Pisces in the second house, it could be really challenging because you're so idealistic. You might forget to pay your taxes or, things along those lines. So this is a time of really taking responsibility for your finances. Yeah, there's,
nice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think overall it's like that. Yeah, it's a challenge, partly because it's in Pisces, like you mentioned. But yeah, the second house is a tricky house because part of the reason why it has its reputation as a tricky house is because you can't really see it can't really see the ascendant. It's kind of like when you're sitting at a dinner table and the person's sitting right next to you, and you can't quite see them unless you turn and face them. So there's something about having to turn and face this issue around not valuing yourself enough, and it's a tricky little number to have Saturn going through there. It's probably could be uncomfortable. It depends what you have there. If you have a planet there, if you have Mercury there or something, this is going to be very prominent, so again, check your natal chart and see if you have something particular in any of these spots, but in your second house. So all right, and for our finale, we have Pisces. What a shock. If you have Pisces rising, then you have Saturn moving through the first house. So this is a time of major kind of overhaul / facelift on how you are taking responsibility for yourself as a human walking on the planet. I mean, you're a Pisces rising, so big idealistic things. You have, that means you have your ascendant here. So no matter what, at some point, Saturn is going to connect with that extremely sensitive point of your ascendant. So if you have Pisces rising, there's no chance this isn't totally deeply personal. There's some kind of big shift in the way that you need to take responsibility for yourself. And that's kind of what's happening right now.
Yeah,
So.
and taking responsibility for how you present yourself to others. You know, yeah, it's like you really want to, if you've got Pisces rising, this is really an important time to just kind of slow down, take some time, and try to get clear. It's not easy, especially with Pisces rising, but try to get clear about how you do present yourself to others. How do others experience you? Because you really need to kind of get serious about that and take responsibility for showing up in a way that really reflects who you are. And that can be tricky with all of us. Our rising sign is how we have to express ourselves, but who knows where our sun and moon might be. There's always that figuring out how to show up in the world. And that's a lot of what this process is for you, is figuring out how to show up in the world.
Yeah. There's also the you're making me remember too, there's also the directional piece to the ascendant. It's kind of like the captain of the ship, you know, or it's the ship. Where's the ship of your life is pointed in a certain direction, and it's always being pointed in the Pisces direction for you, this dreamy, imaginative space. But with Saturn here, it's like, oh, and now I got to really do that. I got to really buckle down and make sure that I'm in alignment with that. I mean, so
That I'm steering it.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh, I
exactly.
love that you
You're
said
working
that.
with it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
but anyway, I think this concludes our video. Hopefully you're still with us here at the end, because this one's a little bit of a different one. But thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, this was fun. I enjoyed doing this a lot, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you. And
Thank you, Laurie.
we will do another one of these before you know it.
Thank you. Bye.